Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to present to you some highlights from the CDDF workshop on endpoints in cancer drug development on behalf of the program committee for this workshop. This presentation reflects my personal views and not necessarily those of Bayer. The CDDF workshop on endpoints in cancer drug development was a 3-day multi-stakeholder workshop that was conducted in April 2021. The objective of the workshop was to address current challenges with the definition and contextualization of endpoints in cancer drug development and commercialization. The focus of this workshop was on problem solving through debate and discussion. The workshop was organized along 3 key topics. The first topic is when OS or overall survival cannot be the primary endpoint. The second, endpoints in expedited regulatory pathways. And the third was PRO endpoints and review of strategies. Day 1 was focused on when overall survival cannot be the primary endpoint. The discussion centered on how overall survival is still the most important endpoint for patients. However, success in the past in achieving long overall survival and also a larger choice of treatments often leads to challenges in using overall survival as the primary endpoint for certain indications. Therefore, novel endpoints become extremely important. However, these novel endpoints cannot be assessed in isolation of other endpoints or the disease context. They need to be carefully validated with evidence from different trials. Still, alternate endpoints may not always correlate with overall survival. So one needs to always think about strategies to correlate novel endpoints with the appropriate established endpoints. Alternate endpoints are important, and this was discussed as part of the EU regulatory perspective. Progression-free survival is an important registrational endpoint, and it can be clinically relevant, but one needs to make sure or need to consider that there is no detrimental effect on overall survival when using PFS as the primary endpoint. Earlier endpoints like objective response rate, along with duration of response, is considered a direct measure of anti-tumor activity, but not necessarily a direct measure of clinical benefit per se. Patient-reported outcomes can be a valid primary endpoint, but there are some problems associated with these data. Very often there are some quality issues. These are not subject to type 1 error control, and this frequently the problem of missing data. So if these are considered and well controlled for, then PROs can be very helpful in providing useful information that can often be used as alternate novel endpoints. There were 2 case studies that were presented on the novel endpoints. One was on Merkel cell carcinoma, and this was on avelumab, where an alternate endpoint was used for the approval of avelumab for the treatment of Merkel cell carcinoma, and the endpoint used was best overall response. Initially, regulators preferred randomized controlled trials with progression-free survival as the endpoint. Response rate, along with defined follow-up, was accepted by the regulators. One should note that this is in the rare disease setting, and also there was a high unmet need. The approval was based on a single-arm trial with historical control. The randomized controlled trial was considered not feasible, and totality of evidence was accepted to support approval. The other case study was focused on a fairly common tumor type, which is prostate cancer. In this case, it was non-metastatic castration-resistant prostate cancer. And this dealt with the approval of 3 drugs within the same class: apalutamide, enzalutamide, and darolutamide. The novel endpoint that was used here was metastasis-free survival, MFS. MFS emerged on based on multi-stakeholder discussion, and overall survival was considered not feasible for this specific disease stage. MFS was considered a reasonable endpoint for clinical benefit if it was of acceptable magnitude, there was absence of detrimental toxicity, and a positive trend in overall survival. The regulators, both in the US and EU, accepted MFS for full approval, and these drugs are currently approved in many countries around the globe outside the EU as well as the US. So MFS, a novel endpoint, was the basis of approval in the case of these three drugs, and it was also able to demonstrate a correlation with overall survival, which is the gold standard. Day 2 was focused on endpoints and expedited pathways. For patients, expedited pathways are extremely important, and therefore for all other stakeholders as well, expedited pathways are very important. Despite this acknowledgement, there is still challenges associated with the use of novel endpoints and expedited pathways, because earlier endpoints, which are often the novel endpoints that are considered, need to be seen in the context of novel drugs or treatment, and also in the context of the disease over time. The main challenge seen by patients is the regulatory versus the HTA gap, where earlier approval is not necessarily correlated with earlier access. From the regulator's perspective, in this case, the discussion was led by the US FDA. OS is the gold standard. Earlier endpoints are important, especially overall objective response rate is the main endpoint for accelerated approval, ideally for a molecularly defined population. But when benefit is not confirmed, accelerated approvals may be reevaluated. Various regulatory tools exist in the US to allow early approval, example, real-time oncology review, and the assessment aid as well. From the HTA's perspective, the main challenges seen were with respect to the unclear relationship between the surrogate endpoint with the key outcome, which is overall survival or quality of life data. There's often lack of comparative data, which is a problem for HTAs, and also very small data sets. Different approaches are in use to address uncertainty at the HTA level, and therefore early dialogue with the HTAs is considered to be key. Patient-reported outcome as an endpoint, review of strategies. For patients, of course, the PRO needs to be relevant, and it should capture not only impact of disease, but it should also include a description of, it should actually capture impact of disease rather than just a description of the side effects. That was important for patients. Participants need to understand scoring as well as questions. And patients are interested in the results of these data, and patient organizations can also help with multi-regional studies by helping translate into local language, creation of manuals, and also providing other types of training to enable these trials on a global scale. For regulators, there is a need to discuss the PRO objectives as well as the research questions with health authorities. The PROs should focus on areas directly related to the disease, and the treatment should be meaningful for patients and providers, as reflected by the comments of the patients as well. Sponsors and other stakeholders involved in the collection of PRO data should consider alternate methods to collect data, example, wearables and sensors. Data quality, as always, is key for any regulatory submission. From the industry perspective, there was definitely a lot of support for the inclusion of the patient voice throughout the life cycle of a program. However, this requires very early planning, and it also requires standardization, or standardization can be helpful when you're trying to integrate the patient's voice. And de novo PROs can often be challenging when one is considering expedited pathways for approval. For HTAs, key endpoints are survival and quality of life. Quality of life should be collected early in the clinical trials, and it should become routine. PRO data should reflect current treatment as well as novel methods are very important. Academia felt that successful PRO outcomes require tailored, trial-specific PRO hypothesis. There is a need for better standardization, but it should also allow for flexibility. And the option to use computerized adaptive testing was encouraged. So in summary, this workshop really enabled a robust discussion on a number of points that are very relevant and timely in terms of looking at problems in cancer drug development. The relationship to overall survival and quality of life is an important takeaway, that whenever one considers a novel endpoint, it's always important to connect it back to established endpoints. Data, especially post-progression data, extremely important to collect, and it's important to understand routine care settings as well as sequence of treatments. PROs offer a really great opportunity to everyone involved in drug development. The opportunity to utilize novel technologies for data collection, extrapolation, questionnaires, and also agreement on the level of standardization are all key points for consideration. Regulatory pathway. Tools do exist that support expedited pathways. Example, the US Real-Time Oncology Review, post-approval, Real-Time Oncology Review, as well as accelerated approval. However, when you have these expedited pathways in play, either in the US or EU or anywhere else in the world, the post-approval measures become very important. Therefore, leveraging global synergies is very important, whether you pursue an expedited pathway or regular pathway. Paying attention to where you can leverage the global synergies would ultimately help patients. Closing the evidence gap between regulators and HTA bodies is also very important, and therefore there is a need to discuss the evidence plan early with health authorities as well as HTAs on the pivotal trial design, endpoint, PROs, as well as post-approval data generation plans as well. So I'd like to thank CDDF for the opportunity to have such a robust discussion at this workshop. Also would like to acknowledge all presenters and panelists at the Endpoints workshop, and especially the CDDF program committee members, Axel Glassmacher from CDDF, Ralph Herold from EMA, Claudia Hay from Merck KGA, and Denny Lacombe from URTC, who worked many hours to put the program together, and also all the board members of CDDF. Thank you very much.